Hello, this is HFA Speaks the podcast. I'm your host, Jackie Howdegi, social media and web intern for the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts. Our guest today is Professor Stephanie Malia Hom, Associate Professor of Transnational Studies, Vice Chair of UCSB French and Italian, and Director of the Italian Program. She was awarded the Boyasco Foundation Fellowship and an ad hoc Barbieri Grant in Modern Italian History from the Cesare Barbieri Endowment for Italian Culture. Her upcoming books will explore the relationship between slavery and race in Italy. Welcome to HFA Speaks, Professor Hom.
Thank you, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. To start off, where did your interest in this topic come from?
Well, thank you for that question. So I like to think of my research really as focused on mobility. So I've been very concerned in my work about the differences between people who can move by choice, like tourists, and those who are moved by force, like refugees and asylum seekers. So my first book was actually on tourism and tourists. And when I was living in Rome, writing that book, I would go to souvenir shops, I would follow tours, I went to the old pilgrimage churches in Rome, and I was getting a real sense of the ways that tourists were experiencing Italy. At the same time, because I was living there for a long period of time, I had to get a visa, I had to go get my permit of stay, and I went out to what's known as the Questura, which is a police station on the periphery of Rome. And that is where one goes to apply for your permit of stay. It's this one place in all of Rome. And I went out there, and as an American, I'm considered an extracomunitario. Right? I'm from outside of the EU, and I have a certain categorical status in relation to Italy. And when I got there, there was a huge line around the block at this Questura. People from all over the world, right? From East Africa, from North Africa, from East Asia. And because of the color of my skin, the fact that I spoke the language, because of my cultural privilege, I was sort of ferried to the front of the line. And I had a moment like, oh my goodness, like how do I had the exact same juridical status as everybody else in line, and yet I am being accorded this privilege. And that started me questioning this difference between those who move by choice and those who move by force, and how to reconcile my own privilege and my own position as an American woman who is representing an academic institution overseas. How do I account for that in my research? And that was the experience that became the impetus for Empire's Mobius strip. And I had studied Italian colonialism, colonial history in graduate school, but seeing its ramifications in real life, in real time, playing out in places, in debates about citizenship, in being able to get things like permits of stay, in the current migration crisis, that's what inspired that book. And in that book, I look at the connections between migration and Italy's colonial history.
For those unfamiliar with topology and mathematics, why did you compare the Italian Empire and its history to the Mobius strip?
Yes, so that's a great question. So the Mobius strip, as you know, it looks like an infinity symbol, and it sort of loops back on itself over and over again. Because I actually wrote this almost as a throwaway comment in my book prospectus. I said something, I was writing the prospectus, giving a summary, and I said something to the effect like a Mobius strip, that Italy's past and its present fold back on one another. And my editor said, that's a great title for the book. And that became the guiding metaphor, that in fact, colonialism didn't end, but it simply transmogrified, right? That the people who live in former colonies are still, dealing with the imprint and the after effects. I like to say the ripple effects of Italy's colonial project. And And likewise in Italy too, there is not much awareness. It's growing, but there has not traditionally been much awareness about its colonial history, even though Italy held colonies or occupied territories, Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, Libya, roads of the Dodecanese, and for a brief period Albania, occupied these places for the better part of over 50 years, right? In places like Eritrea from 1890 to 1943. So it was a long tenure. And so for me, I was interested in the way that this long tenure that shaped these places and these people's lives historically, how that also resurfaces in the present. And so that's why I think the Mobius strip is such an apt metaphor, because it keeps folding back on itself.
This isn't a conversation being had. I don't think that there is as strong of an understanding of Italian colonialization as opposed to perhaps English or French. I think that is much more clear for people. And so what I'm curious about is, why do you think that the impact of its colonial history has been downplayed?
That's a great question. Again, I would say that Italy's colonial history was disavowed, right? That in part because it was linked with fascism. It was so closely linked with Mussolini's dictatorship, even though the Italian colonial project began before the dictatorship. But it was really with the ascent of Mussolini and the regime taking hold both in Italy, that Italian colonial policy became more brutal, more violent. And in February in Ethiopia, there is the memory of what's called Yakatit 12, which is in 1937, the Viceroy, Rodolfo Graziani, there was an assassination attempt on him while he was visiting Addis Ababa. There were 10 grenades lobbed into the crowd, he was gravely injured, but he lived, and he gave carte blanche to Italian soldiers as well as conscripts into the Italian army to essentially carry out a genocide. There are, in the course of 3 days, there are estimates of between 19,000 and 30,000 people were killed in 3 days. And that in Ethiopia is known as Yakatit 12. And it's memorialized, it's remembered, it's completely disavowed in Italian historiography. And this is just one example of the way that colonial memories are pushed down or repressed. At the same time, if they are remembered at all, yes, it's something to the effect of colonialism light, that Italians weren't as brutal as, say, the French or the British. Often it's covered over with this myth of Italians as good colonizers, or Italiani brava gente, that there's this idea that we were benevolent colonizers. Italians were benevolent colonizers. And that, I think, too, has had an effect of, like you said, downplaying this idea of, Italy's colonial history.
So you talked about the link to fascism.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of want to talk about this current political zeitgeist, specifically within the context of Italy. I think Italy is part of this global trend of right-wing populism, so much so that the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has been tied to fascism and intolerant ideas. Is that fair to say?
Oh, that is very fair to say, yes.
Okay. So at the same time, these conversations surrounding migration, slavery, and race require the country to confront these brutal histories and its dark past. And so what are the tensions in Italy right now surrounding these two things?
Well, that's a big question. When I was writing the book, Empire's Mobius Strip, and I would go to these places, like I would go to migrant detention centers in Italy and monuments to fascist war criminals, it was very much I would visit these places. It was also important for me to realize that here in the US, we have also this legacy of settler colonialism. So I would go to places like the Spanish missions. I went to Manzanar, where Nisei, or Japanese, were interned in 1942. I needed to connect with the spaces here with that embodied the same dynamic of the Mobius strip that I was writing about in Italy. So I wanted to say that it wasn't simply, it's not Italy, but these are lessons that we can look at here in the States as well. Coming back to your question about fascism and the current rise of populism, not just in Italy, but across Europe, as well as here in the United States, there is a very direct link between Giorgia Meloni and the political party she represents, which is the Brothers of Italy Party, and Mussolini's fascist party. And if you look from 1945 through to the present day, the fascist party transformed into what was called the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the MSI party, which existed for several decades. When you look at their logo, it's represented, there's a tricolor flame on it. In 1994, the MSI party transforms into Alleanza Nazionale, the National Alliance Party. It spelled the end of the Christian Democrats, the dominance of this party. That party fell apart, and Berlusconi, filled that power vacuum. In the meantime, up in the northern part of Italy, there is a very extreme right-wing xenophobic party called the Northern League. All of that to say, around 2018, Alleanza Nazionale transforms into Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy party that Meloni represents. The Northern League rebrands itself as the League itself. There's another party on the scene too called the Five Star Movement, but all said, these parties form an alliance, and they end up essentially gaining many seats in parliament, and by 2022, Giorgia Meloni becomes prime minister. And I will say that the Brothers of Italy party, their logo is that tricolor flame. So you can trace that direct kind of graphic genealogy between Mussolini's party, the MSI, the Alleanza Nazionale, and the Brothers of Italy. So we have, Meloni is a direct political descendant of that. So fascism, the study of fascism and authoritarianism, is today never more urgent, because what we see Meloni doing is she's taking plays right out of Mussolini's playbook, the strongman playbook, as a scholar named Ruth Ben-Gia calls it, in her rhetoric, in her policies, in the way that she is governing, right? It's very much moving toward a rigid, not quite at authoritarianism with her yet. She's had to cooperate a bit on the European level, but certainly in terms of immigration policy, she has been very hardline. And what we find her doing is creating more and more bureaucratic obstacles to immigration. And these were similar to obstacles or bureaucratic kind of entanglements that were created for colonial subjects under Italian rule in places like Libya or in Eritrea.